Under the glow of string lights and the breath of winter air, the town of Hallowbrook gathered for what had always been its most celebrated event. The Winter Carnival arrived every January, a tradition that drew families from every corner of the valley. Snow packed the sidewalks into hard, glittering paths. Vendors lined the park with steaming kettles of cocoa, candied nuts, and fried dough. Children darted between rides and ice sculptures, their voices cutting through the icy air like bells. For 7-year-old Jacob Hanley, it was a night of pure excitement. He had begged his parents for weeks to bring him, saving coins in a jar for extra rides, and when the evening finally came, he raced ahead, wide-eyed at the carousel horses frozen in mid-prance and the towering Ferris wheel lit in shades of blue and gold. Jacob was the kind of boy everyone in town recognized. He had a quick smile, a mop of blonde hair that stuck out beneath his knit cap, and a habit of clutching the little toy car he carried everywhere. That night, bundled in his red jacket, he blended with the other children rushing toward games and stands. Yet somehow he stood out to his mother, who kept a constant watch. For the first hour, everything seemed ordinary. They watched ice carvers work blades across blocks that gleamed like glass. They skated clumsily on the rink near the bandstand, Jacob laughing when he fell, and his father helped him up. It was the kind of evening parents hoped would stay tucked in their memories forever, until, in an instant, it twisted into something else entirely. Around 7 o'clock, Jacob tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked for hot cocoa. She pointed toward the vendor stand just a short distance away and told him to wait for her by the barrels after she bought it. Witnesses would later remember seeing him there, standing small against the backdrop of bundled adults, his mittens pressed together as he watched the steam rise into the air. A classmate swore she saw him drop his toy car and bend to pick it up. A vendor recalled him smiling politely as he waited, but when his mother returned with the drink, Jacob was gone. At first, she thought he had simply stepped into the crowd, drawn by music from the carousel or the smell of roasted chestnuts. She called his name once, then again, her voice drowned by the swell of laughter and brass instruments. Her husband began weaving through people, scanning faces, expecting to see Jacob's red jacket bobbing ahead. Minutes stretched thin, and the air seemed to tighten. Other parents noticed the panic rising in her voice. Strangers began looking around as well, pulling children closer. The music faltered, stuttered, then stopped. By the time the loudspeakers announced a temporary halt to the festivities, Jacob's absence had shifted from a parent's fleeting worry to the dread of something irreversible. Police were called within 20 minutes. Officers arrived quickly, their boots crunching overs, packed snow as they asked the crowd to remain calm and stay within the gates. Lights from patrol cars washed over the carnival's bright colors, turning the festive glow into something colder. Announcements echoed through loudspeakers. A child missing, 7 years old, red jacket, blonde hair. Families huddled together as officers and volunteers began combing every corner of the fairgrounds. Jacob's mother clutched the untouched cup of cocoa, still steaming, her voice breaking as she told officers she had been gone less than a minute. Witness statements trickled in, each slightly different but none definitive. Some swore they saw Jacob near the cocoa stand. Others claimed he walked toward the skating rink. One carnival worker thought he saw a child being led toward the ice house used for carving competitions, but he couldn't be certain. Dogs were brought in to track his scent, but with so many people crowding the grounds, trails overlapped and confused even trained noses. Still, they seemed to pause near the ice house before circling aimlessly, unable to push farther. The crowd thinned as families were escorted out. Parents clutched their children tighter than ever. Snow continued falling, light and steady, dusting empty rides and stalls as the carnival shut down. By midnight, the grounds resembled less a festival than a scene frozen mid-motion, as if joy had been ripped out of it in one sharp pull. Jacob's parents refused to leave, standing near the place they had last seen their son, faces pale and raw against the cold. Officers promised them every measure was being taken, every inch of ground searched. But the only thing louder than the crunch of boots and the sweep of flashlights was the silence where a boy's voice should have been. Neighbors whispered that he must have wandered into the woods, maybe slipped on the frozen lake. Others feared something worse, that someone had taken him. But that night, there was no answer. The carnival, a place built on laughter and tradition, had become the last place anyone saw Jacob Hanley alive. And though officers swept the grounds until dawn, turning over every barrel and booth, the truth was already slipping beyond reach. By the time the sun rose, the only thing left was an absence no one could explain, and a growing realization that a child could vanish in plain sight in the middle of a crowd without leaving a trace. What began as a celebration had become the darkest night Hallowbrook had ever faced, and it was only the beginning. Floodlights blazed across the fairgrounds as midnight turned into the early hours of morning. What had been a place of joy only hours before was transformed into a grid of flashing blue lights, caution tape, and officers moving in calculated lines. Every ride was shut down, every booth abandoned, their decorations and lights left to flicker against the cold wind. The laughter and music that had carried across the park earlier in the night were gone. Now the only sounds were radios crackling, dogs barking, and the muffled calls of Jacob's name echoing into the night. Police wasted no time. They divided the fairgrounds into zones and began clearing them one by one. Officers moved through the empty carnival rides, opening funhouse doors, checking beneath booths, and rattling the locks on storage sheds. Even the Ferris wheel was checked, its cars swinging slightly in the wind as officers climbed the icy steps to make sure no child had crawled inside. Volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder, combing the snow-covered park with flashlights. Families who had stayed behind wrapped blankets around themselves, waiting and watching in disbelief as the celebration became a search scene. At 1 a.m., the county brought in K-9 units. Dogs pressed their noses to Jacob's mittens and toy car, then lunged forward with urgency, tugging handlers across the grounds. Their tracks cut quickly through the snow, drawing straight lines toward the lake. The frozen surface stretched wide, gleaming pale under searchlights, and every parent watching felt their stomach drop. The thought of a child wandering out onto the brittle ice was almost too much to bear. Officers spread out in careful lines, probing the frozen surface with poles, testing for breaks, searching for any hole or disturbance. But the ice held solid. The dogs, circling, barked and then pulled back toward the carnival, leading their handlers not onto the lake but around its edge, directly toward the temporary ice house. The ice house was a centerpiece of the carnival, a rectangular structure built fresh each year from packed blocks of ice for carving contests and displays. Under the glow of floodlights, it looked eerie now, its smooth walls glistening as if concealing something. Officers swept it from end to end, shining lights through every crack, pounding on the ice to test for hollow spaces. They opened every storage chest and checked beneath work tables where sculptors had left tools. The dogs barked, noses pressed to the walls, but there was no sign of Jacob inside. After an hour of searching, the scent trail stopped cold at the very edge of the structure, and the dogs paced restlessly in circles, unable to push the trail any farther. Helicopters joined the effort before dawn, their spotlights cutting across the woods and frozen fields beyond the carnival. The steady thrum of their blades echoed over the town, waking residents who hadn't yet heard what had happened. People came from their homes in coats and boots, offering to join the search. By 3 a.m., more than 100 volunteers were combing the surrounding woods, their flashlights moving like fireflies through the trees. Officers shouted instructions over bullhorns, warning everyone to stay in line and call out if they found anything, a piece of clothing, a footprint, any trace at all. Snow muffled sound, and the forest swallowed light, but still they pressed on, determined, not to let a 7-year-old disappear without a fight. Inside the fairgrounds, detectives interviewed vendors and workers who had remained behind. One man said he thought he saw Jacob headed toward the skating rink. Another swore he spotted him near the carousel. A carnival worker claimed he saw a child in a red jacket being led by the hand toward the ice house, but he admitted he couldn't be sure it was Jacob. Each account conflicted with the last, and none provided the breakthrough investigators needed. With so many children in red jackets that night, the line between fact and faulty memory blurred quickly. Detectives scribbled notes in their pads, their expressions grim. By 4 a.m., the carnival grounds looked less like a place of festivity and more like a crime scene. Barricades blocked the entrances, and deputies turned away curious onlookers. The smell of fried dough and cocoa still lingered faintly in the cold air, but the stands were dark, abandoned mid-shift, cups and napkins frozen to the tabletops. Parents stood together in small groups, some clutching their own children tighter, others whispering fears they didn't want to voice aloud. Jacob's mother refused to leave, her eyes locked on the spot where she had last seen him, the cup of cocoa long since gone cold in her hand. His father walked in restless circles, demanding answers no one could give. The hours dragged until dawn began to break, casting gray light over the snow. After nearly 6 hours of searching, no trace of Jacob had been found, no footprints leading away, no clothing discarded in the woods, no hole in the lake ice to explain a tragic accident. The only thing investigators had was a scent that vanished at the walls of the ice house and the gnawing realization that the trail ended where it should not have. As the sun rose on Hallowbrook, the winter carnival stood silent, its bright decorations now covered in frost, its empty rides swaying gently in the wind. The search would continue through the day, expanding into the hills and woods beyond, but the first night had ended in failure. For the family and for the town, hope was already beginning to slip away. The carnival had promised joy, but by morning it was a place of dread, and the image of a boy vanishing into the cold air hung over everyone like a shadow that would not leave. Detectives knew that in cases like this, the first hours and days were crucial. With no sign of Jacob after the exhaustive overnight search, their focus shifted quickly from the fairgrounds to the people who had been there. Every vendor, worker, and volunteer was questioned. Officers moved methodically, taking statements in the small warming tent the carnival had used earlier in the evening. One by one, names and faces were added to a growing list, and patterns began to emerge. Suspicion first fell on a man named Dennis Rourke. He was a drifter who had been working with the carnival for only a few weeks, setting up rides and hauling equipment. Rourke had a record: breaking and entering, petty theft, and a charge of indecent exposure from years earlier. His name set off alarms the moment it surfaced. Witnesses recalled he had been drinking heavily that night, wandering between booths, sometimes pestering families. But when investigators searched for him after Jacob's disappearance, he was gone. His camper, parked near the fairground lot, was abandoned. Tire tracks in the snow suggested he had pulled out sometime after the carnival was shut down. Detectives quickly labeled him a person of interest, but without a current address or vehicle registration, he vanished as completely as Jacob had. Another thread pointed closer to home. A family acquaintance, Alan Pierce, was among the volunteers who had helped build the carnival's ice structures. He was friendly with Jacob's father, often lending tools or helping with odd jobs. But several witnesses recalled seeing him near the cocoa stand shortly before Jacob disappeared. He had the kind of access few others did: knowledge of the carnival's layout, storage areas, and even the temporary locks installed on some of the booths. Detectives pressed him in interviews, but Pierce denied having seen Jacob at all that night. His alibi was thin. He claimed he had been repairing a generator near the skating rink. No one could confirm it. His calm demeanor unsettled some investigators, but without physical evidence, they had nothing to hold him on. Beyond the immediate suspects, rumors spread through Hallowbrook like fire through dry grass. Some said Jacob had been targeted by traffickers, snatched and moved quickly into a waiting vehicle. Others whispered that he had simply wandered onto the frozen lake, hidden beneath the surface where no one could see. Theories flourished in the absence of facts, each one darker than the last. Parents kept their children close, locking doors in a town where people once left them open. Every unfamiliar car was watched, every stranger noted. The division didn't stop with speculation. Families who once shared church pews and school bleachers began pointing fingers at one another. Old grudges resurfaced, now sharpened by fear. Some insisted the drifter Rourke had been responsible, a convenient villain who had disappeared the same night. Others quietly believed the Pierce family was hiding something, convinced that the boy had been lured by someone he trusted. Detectives tried to quell the rumors, reminding the town that evidence had to guide the case, but whispers carried more weight than reassurance. Reporters arrived within days, setting up cameras near the carnival gates. They ran stories with titles like The Vanishing at Hallowbrook and Carnival of Shadows, fueling speculation further. Interviews with neighbors played on evening news channels, some describing suspicious figures, others repeating half-heard details as if they were fact. For Jacob's family, the scrutiny was unbearable. His mother could barely leave the house without questions shouted across the street. His father, under immense stress, grew short-tempered with detectives, demanding they stop chasing theories and start finding his son. Meanwhile, investigators pored over surveillance footage. Cameras mounted on poles near the entrance gates showed Jacob arriving with his family. Other angles caught him skating on the rink and walking through the vendor area. But at the moment he was last seen, the crowd was thick, snow blew across the lenses, and the image blurred. Dozens of red jackets moved across the screen, any one of them possibly Jacob. No camera ever showed him leaving. It was as if he had dissolved into the crowd and been erased. Detectives kept circling back to the ice house. The dogs had stopped there, and the building itself was large enough to hide someone, but every sweep of the structure turned up nothing. Still, some officers suspected that whoever was responsible had used it as a staging point. The theory lingered, unproven, but never dismissed. By the second week, the case had already begun to fracture. Leads went cold. Rourke, the drifter, was still missing. Pierce, the family acquaintance, was watched closely but not charged. Rumors of trafficking spread so widely that state authorities were brought in, checking highways and border towns for signs of a boy matching Jacob's description. Nothing came of it. The absence of clarity took its toll. Neighbors stopped speaking to one another, suspicious of anyone who lingered too long near a playground or walked alone after dark. Parents kept children home from school carnivals and winter games, traditions that once bound the community together. The carnival grounds, still cordoned off by tape, became a scar in the middle of town, a reminder that something unthinkable had happened under bright lights and music. What haunted everyone most was how close they had been, hundreds of eyes, all watching, all celebrating, and yet no one able to say exactly where Jacob had gone. With each passing day, the hope of finding him alive dimmed. What remained was a gnawing sense of mistrust, a fear that the truth was buried somewhere close, hidden by someone who still walked among them. Winter turned to spring, and the snow that once preserved every footprint around the fairgrounds melted away, taking with it any chance of new evidence. Detectives returned to the carnival grounds repeatedly in the weeks after Jacob's disappearance, walking the empty lanes where rides had stood and staring at the ground, as if the thaw might somehow release a clue they had missed. But each search ended the same. Nothing. The security footage that had once seemed promising was reviewed frame by frame, enhanced by specialists, even slowed and color-corrected. But the blinding glare of falling snow made it impossible to distinguish one small figure from another. In every angle, Jacob appeared, and then he didn't, swallowed by the blur of winter. The belongings he had carried that night offered no more clarity. His mittens, found in the snow near the cocoa stand, were dusted for prints and fibers, but yielded nothing beyond his own DNA. The small toy car, a constant companion he rarely let out of his hand, showed no foreign prints or markings. Both items became symbols more than evidence, held up at press conferences and posted on missing person bulletins. To Jacob's parents, they were proof that he had been there and then gone, leaving behind only the things he had loved most. To investigators, they were frustrating dead ends. As months passed, frustration grew louder. The carnival company, already on edge from public outrage, became the target of lawsuits filed by families who argued security had been lax. They demanded to know why no cameras had been stationed near the cocoa stand, why entrances weren't better monitored, why children could so easily slip through the crowd unnoticed. Lawyers and insurance adjusters descended on Hallowbrook, turning grief into paperwork. The carnival organizers released statements expressing sorrow, but to Jacob's family those words felt empty, drowned out by legal disclaimers and negotiations that had nothing to do with finding their son. The Hanleys refused to let Jacob's name fade. His mother, Megan, began organizing vigils, standing in church basements and town halls with candles burning in cups of wax-stained paper. She carried his school photo in a plastic frame, her voice breaking as she spoke of the boy who loved sledding, the boy who never let go of his toy car, the boy who had promised to help decorate their Christmas tree the night he vanished. Local volunteers joined her, passing out flyers at gas stations, malls, and other carnivals across the state. By summer, Jacob's face was stapled to telephone poles and bulletin boards far beyond Hallowbrook, the edges of his posters curling in the heat. Tips began trickling in from neighboring towns. A boy resembling Jacob was spotted at a truck stop, 2 counties over, but the child turned out to be traveling with his grandparents. A family in a nearby city swore they saw him at a 4th of July parade, but the boy identified was not Jacob. Each tip sparked a surge of hope in his mother, followed by the crushing blow of disappointment when it collapsed under scrutiny. Detectives chased every lead, no matter how faint, but every time they arrived, they found nothing. The cycle of hope and heartbreak left scars deeper than silence. Theories multiplied as time stretched on. Some insisted he had wandered onto the frozen lake that night and slipped beneath the ice, his body lost in the current until spring thaw carried him away. Others clung to the belief he had been taken, whisked out of town before the search even began. A few whispered that Jacob's disappearance was connected to his own family. Dark rumors of custody disputes or debts no one dared to confirm aloud. Detectives investigated each possibility, clearing Jacob's parents after extensive questioning, but the whispers never fully disappeared. By autumn, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. The task force dwindled from dozens of officers to a handful still chasing paperwork and reviewing the same footage for the 100th time. Case files filled boxes in the county station, each binder labeled but none containing the answer everyone needed. The carnival grounds, once sealed off by police tape, were cleaned and reopened to the public, though few could stomach walking past the spot where Jacob had last been seen. Vendors refused to set up in that area, calling it cursed. Children turned their heads as parents hurried them along. The holidays arrived, and with them another blow. On the anniversary of Jacob's disappearance, the carnival lights were strung again, the Ferris wheel turning slowly against the snow. Some residents protested its return, saying it was disrespectful to celebrate in the same place where a child had vanished. Others argued that life had to continue, that the carnival brought in money the town desperately needed. The Hanleys stayed away that year, sitting in their dimly lit living room instead, Jacob's unopened presents still stacked in a corner from the year before. For them, time had stopped. By the end of 2015, the case was formally labeled inactive. Detectives promised it would never be closed, but everyone understood what inactive meant. There were no more leads to chase, no new evidence to test, no direction left to follow. Jacob's photo remained pinned to the bulletin board at the sheriff's office, but the phones stopped ringing and the media stopped calling. For Hallowbrook, the carnival had left behind not joy, but a shadow, a reminder that in the middle of laughter and light, a boy had vanished and not returned. The Hanleys still lit candles in their window each night, waiting for something, anything, to bring Jacob home. But as the year drew to a close, the silence grew heavier, and the once relentless search faded into memory. The case, like the snow that had covered the carnival that night, had frozen solid, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. When January came again, Hallowbrook found itself split between tradition and memory. The winter carnival returned, as it had every year for decades, but now it carried a weight it had never borne before. The snow-laden grounds were decorated with the same string lights, the same painted booths, and the same towering Ferris wheel, yet nothing looked the same. Families whispered about whether it should be allowed at all. Some refused to attend, calling it disrespectful to gather in celebration on the very ground where Jacob had disappeared. Others showed up reluctantly, their laughter subdued, their eyes drifting constantly toward the spot where the cocoa stand had stood the year before. Vendors spoke in hushed tones of a curse that clung to the carnival. Some said the ice house had never melted completely that first year, that fragments of it lingered longer than they should have, as if holding on to something no one could see. Workers avoided certain corners of the grounds, refusing to set up their stalls where Jacob's mittens had been found. Parents clutched their children's hands more tightly, unwilling to let them wander even a few feet ahead. The carnival was still alive, but its spirit had been hollowed out, replaced by tension and unease that no amount of music or lights could dispel. For detectives, January was another reminder of unfinished business. Year after year, as the carnival returned, they quietly pulled Jacob's case files from storage. They spread photographs and notes across desks, tracing the timeline again, hoping that distance had sharpened something they had once overlooked. The surveillance footage was replayed, the witness statements reread, and the theories revisited. But each review ended the same way, with more questions than answers. The scent trail ending at the ice house, the drifter who disappeared, the family acquaintance with access to the grounds, all pieces that never fit together into something whole. Without new evidence, the files were packed back into boxes, and the weight of the unsolved disappearance pressed down harder with each passing year. Inside the Hanley home, grief had reshaped everything. Jacob's father, Mark, withdrew into silence. Once a steady, good-humored man, he grew distant, avoiding conversations that touched on the carnival or the investigation. He spent long hours working late shifts, retreating into routines that left little room for anything else. Friends described him as hollow, a man carrying too much that could never be put down. Megan, on the other hand, clung to what was left. Each January, she returned to the fairgrounds during setup week, placing a photo of Jacob near the gates. Some years she left flowers, others a toy car, but always something that tethered his memory to the place he had last been seen. She stood quietly, sometimes for hours, watching workers prepare, as if hoping one of them might suddenly remember something new. Her presence became part of the carnival itself. Vendors whispered about the woman who came each year, standing alone in the snow. Some offered her hot drinks, others looked away, uncomfortable with the reminder of what had happened. For Megan, it wasn't about what others thought. It was ritual, an act of defiance against forgetting, a way to keep Jacob's name alive in a town where people were beginning to move on. But the strain fractured the family. The marriage between Mark and Megan suffered under the unrelenting weight of loss. Arguments flared quietly behind closed doors, one retreating into silence, the other into obsession. Friends who once gathered with them on carnival nights stopped visiting, unsure of what to say. By the third anniversary, they were no longer seen together in public. Jacob's disappearance had not only taken a child, it had carved a fault line through the lives of those who loved him most. The carnival, once a symbol of joy, became a reminder that safety could be an illusion. Children grew up hearing the story whispered in classrooms and over dinner tables, that a boy had vanished in front of everyone without sound or trace. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the spot at night, claiming they could still hear his name carried in the wind. For Hallowbrook, the carnival was no longer simply tradition, it was haunted. And yet, every January the rides went up, the lights flickered on, and the music played again. Families who came from outside the town didn't feel the same chill. To them, it was just another festival. But for those who lived in Hallowbrook, every laugh, every cheer, and every moment of joy carried the shadow of absence. They remembered that in the middle of all the noise, in the safest place they thought they knew, a boy had vanished, and no one could say how. In the spring of 2023, Hallowbrook was no longer the same town it had been when Jacob disappeared. The winter carnival had quietly stopped 5 years earlier, dwindling until there wasn't enough support to keep it alive. The grounds where the rides and ice houses once stood had grown over with weeds and drifted snow, a neglected patch of land that most locals avoided. For many, the silence was preferable to the reminder of what had been lost there. But when developers announced plans to redevelop the property into a commercial lot, Heavy equipment rolled in, and the earth was disturbed for the first time in years. That decision would uncover something no one expected. As workers dug through soil, still hard with pockets of permafrost, their machines struck remnants of the old Carnival structures. Among them was what remained of the once famous ice house. It had been rebuilt each winter for carving competitions, then allowed to collapse and melt come spring. Yet somehow, portions of the 2015 structure had not vanished entirely. Layers of frozen soil had preserved sections of timber and insulation used to reinforce its walls. The crew thought little of it until they noticed something strange. One section contained a sealed wooden compartment still intact, its boards warped but locked with rusted hardware. At first, the workers assumed it was leftover storage, a forgotten box buried under layers of ice and earth. But when one of them pried a corner loose, he noticed stains on the wood, dark patches that hadn't faded with time. He called the site manager, who took one look and ordered the machinery stopped. Within an hour, police were on scene, surrounding the area with tape as memories of Jacob's case came rushing back. For many of the officers, it was a moment that felt too familiar. The name Ice House had been in the files from the beginning. Forensic teams arrived quickly, careful to document every angle before opening the compartment fully. They used crowbars to pry apart the weakened frame, revealing a narrow space inside, large enough for a small person to crouch or lie down. The air that escaped carried a musty metallic odor that had been trapped for years. Within moments, investigators realized they were staring at a space no one had ever searched in 2015, a cavity concealed within the structure itself. The stains on the boards were tested on site, reacting quickly to presumptive kits for blood. The boards, though aged and decayed, still carried traces of something that had once seeped into the grain. Crime scene technicians worked in silence, their gloved hands careful as they collected samples and photographed the interior. Nothing inside resembled a body, but the placement of the stains suggested something, or someone, had been confined there. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. Word spread quickly across town. Residents gathered at the edge of the taped perimeter, whispering as they watched investigators carry out evidence bags. Many hadn't set foot near the carnival grounds in years, but the news drew them back, compelled by the possibility that after nearly a decade, the silence surrounding Jacob's case might finally break. Jacob's mother was contacted first. When detectives arrived at her home to explain what had been found, she didn't speak for a long time. She simply nodded, her hands shaking, as if she had always known the answer would come from that place. Detectives began reviewing the original files with new eyes. Back in 2015, dogs had tracked Jacob's scent to the very edge of the ice house before losing it. Officers had searched the building repeatedly, convinced they had cleared every inch. But the design had been deceptive. The hidden compartment wasn't marked on any of the blueprints provided by Carnival organizers. It was built behind a false wall, blending seamlessly with the structure. To anyone passing through, it looked solid, ordinary, unremarkable. In the chaos of the search that night, no one had thought to check for cavities within the walls themselves. The revelation left investigators with as many questions as answers. Who had built the compartment? Why had it been sealed? And most of all, had Jacob been there the night he vanished? Forensic teams expanded their search, sifting through surrounding soil for fibers, hair, or bone. The compartment itself was dismantled board by board and shipped to a state laboratory. Every inch was cataloged, every stain tested. For the first time in 8 years, the case that had long been called frozen suddenly burned with new life. For the town, the discovery reopened wounds that had never healed. News crews descended again, their satellite trucks parked along the same streets as before. Headlines read, "Break-in coldest case and Ice House yields disturbing find." Residents who had once tried to move on were pulled back into the memory of that night. The lights, the music, the moment a boy had vanished. Parents clutched their children tighter, just as they had in 2015, reminded that Hallowbrook's darkest night was not buried after all. By the end of the week, detectives stood before microphones in a familiar scene. Flanked by evidence boards, reporters shouting questions, Jacob's photograph displayed once again. The lead investigator's words were careful, but carried the weight of what they had found. We have discovered a concealed space within the structure known as the Ice House. This space was not searched during the original investigation. We believe it is connected to the disappearance of Jacob Hanley. For Jacob's family, the announcement landed like a blow. Hope, however faint, had been kept alive for 8 years. Now, with talk of hidden compartments and blood-stained boards, that hope bent under the weight of something darker. The ice that had once brought the town joy had preserved not just a structure, but a secret. And though no one could yet say exactly what it meant, the message was clear. The Carnival had not simply been the last place Jacob was seen. It might have been the place he never left. When the boards of the icehouse compartment were finally removed and investigators peered inside, the cold silence of the space told its own story. The cavity was narrow, the walls slick with layers of frost that had built up over the years. At first glance it looked empty, but when light swept across the interior, something small and red caught their beams. Frozen against the wall was a child's jacket, stiff with ice, its fabric still faintly visible beneath the frozen crust. Technicians worked carefully to extract it, their gloves trembling as they realized what they were holding. The jacket was faded, but unmistakable. Photographs taken 8 years earlier showed Jacob wearing the same red coat on the night he disappeared. A quick comparison left no doubt, and later, DNA tests confirmed what investigators already believed. They had found Jacob's clothing, preserved as if time itself had been forced to hold on to it. Beside the jacket were smaller traces. A few candy wrappers, crumpled but intact, had been pressed into the corner, their colors muted, but still recognizable as the kind sold at the Carnival concession stands. Nearby lay a single child's shoe, coated in frost but still upright, as if someone had placed it there. None of the items appeared scattered or dropped in panic. Instead, their arrangement felt deliberate, positioned as though hidden or stored with intention. Forensic specialists noted details that unsettled everyone who saw them. The jacket wasn't simply tossed into the cavity, it had been affixed, pinned against the wall by the frozen seep of water, suggesting it had been pressed flat before the space was sealed. The shoe, found near the center, had no sign of mud or wear from outside terrain. The candy wrappers bore faint traces of saliva, tested and confirmed to be Jacob's. Together, the evidence painted a picture that chilled more deeply than the ice itself. Jacob hadn't wandered off into the woods or onto the lake. He had been here, inside the Carnival's most visible attraction, hidden in plain sight. The announcement hit Hallowbrook like a second tragedy. News spread within hours, carried first by local outlets and then by national networks hungry for the story. "Break-in Carnival Cold Case," headlines read, accompanied by images of the recovered jacket displayed on evidence boards. The footage replayed endlessly. Officers carrying sealed bags from the excavation site, detectives standing grim-faced before microphones, Jacob's school photo side by side with the red coat now tagged as evidence. For Jacob's mother, the discovery was unbearable. When reporters aired the story, neighbors said she collapsed into her sister's arms, sobbing as the image of the jacket filled the television screen. 8 years had passed since she last saw her son, and time had etched itself into her face. Lines deeper, hair grayer, shoulders stooped from carrying grief. Seeing the jacket again was like reopening the night he vanished, proof that he had never left the carnival grounds at all. The town held its breath, watching every newscast, waiting for the next piece of information. Some hoped the discovery meant answers at last, that the person responsible might finally be named. Others dreaded what might follow, fearing the truth would confirm their darkest suspicions. Residents gathered in small groups outside the taped perimeter, whispering as police cars came and went. Candlelight vigils reignited, hundreds standing silently in the cold night air, each flame flickering with both sorrow and rage. For investigators, the evidence was a breakthrough, but also a burden. The deliberate placement of the items suggested someone had taken time to hide Jacob's belongings inside the icehouse compartment. It shifted the case from theories of an accident or simple disappearance toward something calculated. The Carnival, once written off as an unfortunate setting, was now a central piece of the crime itself. Detectives reopened old files, re-examining everyone who had access to the structure. National media kept the story alive for weeks, anchors describing Hallowbrook as a town haunted by its own traditions. The jacket, the shoe, the wrappers, these ordinary objects had become symbols of a disturbing secret preserved in ice. And though they answered the question of where Jacob had been, they raised a far heavier one. Who had put him there? And why? Detectives knew the jacket and shoe found inside the ice house were more than remnants of a tragedy. They were proof that Jacob had never left the carnival grounds. The evidence pointed directly to intent, and that meant someone had built the hidden space where the items had been preserved. The task force began combing through the original files again, searching for anyone with the knowledge, access, and opportunity to create such a compartment. The list of suspects, once long and unfocused, narrowed quickly. The transient worker, Dennis Rourke, was the obvious first name revisited. His criminal history and sudden disappearance had kept him in the margins of suspicion for years. But after the discovery, detectives pulled interstate records, tracing him through aliases and reported sightings. Rourke had left the carnival circuit shortly after 2015, resurfacing sporadically in other states before vanishing altogether. What they did find suggested a man drifting from one odd job to another, never staying long, never connected to construction or detailed planning. Rourke might have been dangerous, but he wasn't meticulous. He was unlikely to have drawn up plans for a false wall. One name, however, surfaced with a different weight: Owen Briggs. Briggs had worked for the carnival for more than a decade as a maintenance man and part-time builder. He wasn't a drifter. He was considered reliable, the kind of worker trusted with keys and schematics. He'd been on site every year, often tasked with reinforcing structures and ensuring they met safety standards. In 2015, he was assigned to the ice house, responsible for overseeing insulation and temporary bracing that allowed the carvers to work without risk of collapse. As detectives pulled his old personnel records, a troubling picture emerged. Briggs had died quietly in 2019 of a heart condition, leaving behind little family and few friends. His death had removed him from active suspicion, but now, with the discovery of the compartment, his role demanded closer scrutiny. The break came when investigators located a storage unit under his name. Rent had not been paid for months, and the facility was preparing to auction the contents. Detectives intervened, securing a warrant and entering the unit themselves. Inside, beneath boxes of rusted tools and old carnival signage, they found a large plastic tub filled with rolled papers. When unsealed, the contents revealed original blueprints for carnival structures dating back over a decade. Most were routine sketches, layouts for booths, ride placements, and safety checklists. But several pages stopped investigators cold. They showed detailed drawings of the 2015 ice house, complete with handwritten notes and measurements. In red ink, modifications had been added, walls slightly thicker than necessary, cavities outlined where none should exist, and arrows pointing to access points never mentioned in official plans. One sheet in particular depicted the very same wall where Jacob's jacket had been found years later. The lines of the drawing showed a hollow space behind the surface, carefully concealed from outside view. The handwriting matched other notes confirmed to be Briggs's. It wasn't a mistake or improvisation. It was deliberate design. The evidence reframed everything. Briggs hadn't simply maintained the carnival. He had manipulated its very structures. Detectives theorized he used his role to engineer hiding places no one else knew about, spaces overlooked even during thorough searches. Why he had done it, and whether anyone else had been involved, remained unclear. But the link between Briggs and the ice house was undeniable. News of the discovery spread quickly. Reports described Briggs as the suspect who never left, a man whose work had endured years beyond his death. To the public, it felt like a betrayal. Someone trusted with keeping the carnival safe had instead created a secret chamber within its heart. For Jacob's mother, the revelation landed like another fracture in a story already too broken. She had walked past Briggs countless times in 2015, never imagining that the quiet maintenance man might have been the architect of her son's disappearance. Detectives stood before cameras once more, confirming that the false wall was intentional and that Owen Briggs had designed it. Though Briggs was dead, his storage unit had provided the most significant piece of evidence in nearly a decade. It wasn't enough to explain everything, but it was enough to shift the investigation from a fog of theories into the realm of fact. The town reacted with a mix of outrage and relief. Some were furious that Briggs had escaped justice by dying years earlier. Others felt a grim comfort in knowing that the Carnival's ghost wasn't faceless anymore. The story was no longer just about a boy who vanished. It was about a man who had built the place where he was hidden. Investigators began to assemble the fragments into a single devastating picture. For years, Jacob's disappearance had been treated as a mystery of vanishing, a boy swallowed by a crowd, by the night, perhaps by the wilderness beyond the fairgrounds. But with the discovery of the hidden compartment and Briggs's blueprints, the narrative changed. Detectives laid out the evidence step by step, piecing together the likely sequence of events that had taken place on that frigid night in January 2015. They believed it began at the cocoa stand, where Jacob had last been seen. Witnesses remembered a man nearby, holding tools and wearing the dark jacket common to carnival workers. Some had dismissed him as another employee, blending into the background. Now, reviewing old statements, detectives saw Briggs's name appear again and again, never accused outright, but always present on the margins. Briggs had both the opportunity and the knowledge. He had worked on the ice house that day, moving in and out of the structure while sculptors and visitors admired the carvings. He knew its walls better than anyone else. Forensic testing of the recovered candy wrappers suggested they were the kind distributed free at several booths, including the one where Briggs had been seen earlier that evening. Detectives theorized that he offered Jacob candy, an easy lure for a child already excited by the festival. From there, it would have taken only a few steps to lead him toward the ice house, a structure brightly lit but largely ignored once the carving demonstrations ended. Briggs, with his keys and authority as maintenance man, would have been able to guide Jacob inside without raising suspicion. The false wall was the key. The blueprints showed it was built intentionally, the cavity designed large enough for a child, but narrow enough to remain invisible from the outside. Inside the dismantled boards, investigators found faint markings, scratches etched into the wood, small and irregular. Under magnification, they appeared to be claw marks, consistent with fingernails dragging across the grain. To detectives, it was evidence of Jacob trying to get out. The timeline likely unfolded in minutes. Jacob vanished from the cocoa stand, led by Briggs into the ice house. Once inside, he was placed into the hidden compartment. Whether Briggs intended to return is unknown. Perhaps he planned only to hide the boy temporarily until crowds thinned. But then the carnival shut down abruptly, the search began, and the grounds swarmed with police. In the chaos, Briggs either panicked or chose silence. The false wall was sealed. Jacob was trapped. That night, while helicopters searched the skies and dogs circled the building, Jacob remained inside the very structure being inspected. The K-9 units had been right to stop at the ice house. Their instincts had led them to the exact location, but officers, unaware of the hidden compartment, saw nothing unusual and moved on. The thought haunted everyone who reviewed the case, that Jacob had been feet away from hundreds of searchers calling his name. Forensic analysis suggested that the cold preserved Jacob's belongings, but not his life. The compartment was airtight once the ice thickened overnight. The temperature inside dropped quickly. Detectives concluded that Jacob likely succumbed within hours, alone, unseen, as the search outside stretched into dawn. The claw marks confirmed his struggle, a detail investigators could barely speak aloud at press conferences. The truth hit Hallowbrook with the force of a revelation and a wound all at once. For years, people had speculated about abduction, trafficking, or accidents on the lake. But the reality was more horrifying in its simplicity. Jacob had never left the carnival. He hadn't been spirited away into the night. He had died in the middle of it, entombed inside a wall built by a man everyone trusted to keep the grounds safe. For Jacob's mother, the reconstructed timeline was unbearable. To hear that her son had been trapped just yards away while she screamed his name was a truth that broke something inside her. Neighbors described her retreating even further, shutting curtains, avoiding eye contact, unable to reconcile the nearness of her loss. For the wider town, the revelation turned every memory of the carnival sour. They remembered the music stopping, the floodlights blazing, the searchers combing the grounds. Now they knew the boy they sought had been there the entire time. The sheriff's office released a detailed report, confirming the sequence as the most probable scenario. Though Briggs was dead and would never face trial, his blueprints, the false wall, the evidence inside, and the scratch marks told a story that could not be denied. The community gathered for another vigil, this time not for hope, but for reckoning. People stood in silence near the site of the old ice house, candles trembling in the cold wind. Some whispered Jacob's name, others bowed their heads. The timeline was reconstructed, and with it came closure of a kind, but also a chilling reminder. Jacob hadn't been taken away, hadn't been lost to wilderness or strangers. He had been there all along, hidden in the heart of the carnival, dying within reach of the very people who had tried to save him. The final report left no room for speculation. Investigators confirmed that the false wall inside the ice house had been constructed deliberately, and that Jacob Hanley had died within it on the night of the Winter Carnival. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the case concluded that Owen Briggs, the maintenance man tied to the blueprints, fit the pattern of someone with a hidden history of predatory behavior. Old personnel files revealed he'd been quietly dismissed from smaller fairs in other towns after complaints of inappropriate conduct around children, though none had ever led to charges. In Hallowbrook, he had been trusted, handed keys and responsibility. That trust had given him the means to build a prison in plain sight. Detectives theorized that Briggs hadn't planned Jacob's death in advance. Instead, he saw an opportunity. Luring the boy with candy, he placed him inside the compartment he'd designed, perhaps intending to retrieve him later, perhaps testing the hiding space he had created. But when the carnival shut down in panic, the grounds swarming with officers and searchers, Briggs panicked. He sealed the wall, leaving Jacob trapped. Whether it was fear of discovery or something darker, his decision was final. Jacob's cries were drowned out by the chaos of the search, his struggle hidden behind the very ice that people admired as art. For 8 years, the evidence remained there, untouched, preserved by cold soil and frozen air. The jacket, the shoe, the wrappers, the claw marks on the wood. It had been right at the center of everything, a secret the town walked past without ever knowing. When the compartment was finally revealed, it was as if the carnival itself had confessed to what it had held all along. The case was declared closed. Officially, the disappearance of Jacob Hanley was no longer a mystery. But closure brought no relief, only a heavier grief. For his family, the truth was harder than not knowing. His mother, who had lit candles and prayed for a miracle each January, now faced the reality that her son's final moments were spent just feet from her, unheard and unseen. His father, long withdrawn, stood at the memorial without words, his silence deeper than ever. The memorial was held not by a lake, not in the woods, but on the carnival grounds themselves. Hundreds gathered in the same space where children once skated, where lights once twinkled, where Jacob had asked for cocoa and never returned. A plaque bearing his name was placed at the site of the old ice house, the ground covered in flowers and toys left by strangers and friends alike. Candles flickered in the cold air as the crowd stood together in silence, a town finally united by grief rather than suspicion. The Winter Carnival never returned. The developers abandoned their plans, unwilling to build on land marked so deeply by tragedy. To this day, the grounds remain empty, overgrown in summer and windswept in winter, a hollow place that carries the weight of what was uncovered there. For Hallowbrook, the carnival was no longer a celebration. It was a reminder of how quickly joy could turn into horror and how a boy could vanish not into the dark woods or frozen lake, but into the very heart of a place meant to bring happiness. The disturbing secret had been revealed at last. Jacob had never left the carnival. He had been entombed within it, hidden in ice and silence, while the town searched around him. 8 years later, the truth emerged, not as a miracle, but as the darkest answer imaginable.